Well, welcome everyone. Hi, my name is Jenny Whitener, and I'm the CEO of Bridge Innovate. And it is my pleasure to welcome you today to How Leaders Inspire Future Leaders. We have an amazing guest sharing his perspective on leadership. And first, though, we want to start by getting to know you. If each of you would please go into the chat, say hello, maybe introduce your name and your organization, that would be fantastic. I know our guest we want to say hello to you as well. And I would just encourage you throughout today's program that if you have questions, if you have comments about the content today, please use the chat to engage and shout out particular points of view that you want to share as well. So welcome everyone for How Leaders Inspire Future Leaders. We're glad to have you here today. This program is a part of Bridge Innovate's Inspire series, where we invite leaders from across business sectors and organizations to come in and share their inspiring stories on leadership, change, and innovation. We have an amazing guest with us today. So without further ado, let's go there. I want to welcome Robert Hughes as our guest speaker today. Bob is a retired colonel in the United States Army and the former managing director of executive education at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. Bob spent almost 30 years in the United States Army, retiring in 2015 as colonel. And during his time in the Army, he had the privilege to lead numerous teams and organizations at the tactical, regional, and enterprise level. You should see his CV, guys. With a strong desire to help other leaders be successful, in 2015, Bob began his second career as clinical faculty and managing director of the executive education at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. In 2020, great news for Chattanoogans. Bob relocated with his family here to the Chattanooga area, and is continuing to stay involved in coaching and helping leaders and growing their leadership capabilities. So we're thankful to have Bob Hughes with us today. Thank you, Bob, for being here. Anything else you'd like to share with the group in terms of your background or helping them get to know you?
No, Jenny, thanks for that very kind introduction. I've seen some of the folks where people are, and thank you for joining us today. I just want to say it's a real privilege for me to be here with you today and to be able to talk about the topic of leadership, which I think you and I both agree is just very important and a subject that just needs to keep being talked about. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. One of the things that when you and I talked about this session, we thought would be inspiring is for you to share a few stories, right? Think of the amazing career and the opportunities that you've had to engage with leaders and to shape leaders. Would you humble us with a few stories? Would you start by just sharing with us some stories around leadership and the lessons that you've learned over the years and how we might be able to take those home ourselves?
Yes, I think that'd be great. And as we talked, I thought that I would just share a few of the stories that really impacted my leadership and my personal leadership journey throughout my career in the Army. And most of these will be based in my military time, but they're applicable to leadership at all different organizations and leaders at whatever they do. So happy to share 3 short stories and some of the key takeaways that I think are important from them.
Great. Well, let's hear them. Start us off.
Okay. So, I thought I would share stories today that other leaders and how they really impacted me, because I want the audience to think about how you as a leader or leaders that you work for really impact you and your leadership. So the first of the stories, I would call it, if I had to title this story, In the Hills of Kentucky. And it goes back to the very beginning of my military career, at very beginning as an officer. And it starts at Fort Knox, Kentucky, which is where they train all the armored forces for the Army at the time, where they train all the tankers, as we called in the Army. And so I had finished all of that training, and my first assignment was to be part of a basic training unit to train other soldiers as they first come in the Army. And my very first boss, Ed, was just so important to me. He'd been in the Army for probably 10 years or about 10 to 12 years at that point. So he had a lot more experience than I do. And of course, I'm excited in coming into this my very first job in the Army. And early on, I remember Ed, sometime early in the first month or two in my time there, he stopped by my office one day and he said, "Hey, tomorrow, Bob, let's grab some maps of the local area around Fort Knox. Let's grab some water and some lunch, and let's just go have some professional development." And that's all he said. And I said, of course, I said, okay, I'm intrigued. He didn't go any other detail. And so it was the middle of summer. It was very hot and sticky. I remember that quite well. But we headed out into the countryside around Fort Knox, just Ed and I. And we made our way up onto a hill where we could overlook a valley and some other hills and key terrain or some terrain around the area. And what he wanted to talk about was tactics. And that's what he wanted to say, "Hey, Bob, I want to just spend some time thinking about how you would employ a force through here, how you might defend this area." And that was the professional development he wanted for me, because he knew I would go on to other roles where the tactical piece was important. And of course, this was important because at this point in time, I'd only had predominantly classroom experience and some short field exercises. So I was wanting to soak this in. But as I think about that session with Ed, just sitting on that hilltop, we were just talking. He was, I think, in a sense, coaching, and he was helping me prepare for the future. And so the tactical discussion was certainly important. But I think what's even more important, the more I speak with leaders and think about leadership, was that Ed, as a leader, saw the development of other leaders as his responsibility, one of his many leadership responsibility. And he was investing time in my development. And that was something that just stayed with me my entire career. And of course, I think that, sending folks or sending leaders to training or universities and executive education is exceptionally important. And that's a part of leader development, very important part. But I want to remind the leaders that are there, that are up and coming, or even the leaders that are now in leadership positions, investing that time in the future leaders is just so important, because you remember, these other leaders want to grow. And
Right.
they have aspirations as well. And
Yeah.
so my key takeaways are investing time in other leaders, and it's a responsibility. And that's one of the things that inspired me about Ed.
Right. And I think just hearing your story, how personal it was, right? How one-to-one it was, and him taking that moment to say, let's get some lunch and
Right.
go out, get out of the office for a moment and just have that conversation. So you knew there was a real strong commitment to your
Right.
personal development. You felt it sounds like it felt very authentic, very genuine.
Right.
And this issue today that we're all struggling with, and how to manage time, what a commitment, right? To give them that time and to sit and have that conversation with you. So great reminder that in terms of building leadership, programs are great, but the one-to-one commitment from a leader to another leader, how important that is, and what a gift that can be in terms of giving that time and that coaching. Great.
And with Ed, it wasn't just once. We did it quite a few times. It was frequent. You don't do it every week, and a couple hours every so often, or maybe not even all that. And it wasn't always out in the hills, but the point was, it was that investment. Yes.
Was there a way that he approached that conversation to make you feel open and not, threatened by, how did he make it feel developmental, I guess is my question. And before you answer, I'm going to invite the audience, if they have any questions around leaders developing other leaders or comments, to make those in the chat while we're covering this question. But how did he make it feel safe?
I think, there's that term now that's, Amy Edmondson out of Harvard, coined psychological safety, right? He made it safe because it was very authentic, as you said. He just said, let's just talk about tactics. There was no test. There was no pressure. This was just, hey, what would you do? What's your thinking about this if you had to do this here? employ any or, defend this ground. And he was in it with me. It was a conversation. There was no gotcha moment. There was no agenda other than just to sit and think about this and talk about it and discuss it. So I think just by his authenticity and investing that time in the setting made it feel very safe.
Good point. I see Eva Lewis, good friend of ours. Good to see you, Eva, today on chat. She's also making the comment that making time for reflection, too, is a critical part of this interaction between leader and emerging leader. Good point, Eva. Thanks, Bob. Tell me, you've got me going now. Okay. So give me another story.
Reflection, I'm all about that. That is a key part of leadership development too. The time to spend with yourself and thinking about whatever it is that helps you grow and get better. Thanks for that comment.
Yeah.
Okay.
What else? Tell me another story.
All right. So the second story is, I think, the story of my first failure. And it also occurred at Fort Knox. And if I had to name this one or title this story, I'd call it A Bad Day on the Range. And this story occurred after I had left Ed, working with Ed, and I had moved to another unit on Fort Knox, a tank unit, an armored unit, and that he had helped me prepare for. And I had moved over to that unit. And one of the things you do in an armored organization about twice a year is you have to go to the gunnery range. You have to take all the crews and the tanks and go to the gunnery range and demonstrate proficiency on the range at hitting targets and all the actions that the crew have to do to employ the tank. And so I had been through gunnery before, and we were getting ready to go for one. And this is a milestone event because you actually have to qualify. The standards are pretty high. You get scored. They record everything that goes on in the tank, all the communications between the crew, so they know what actions are going on. They videotape all of the engagements and scenarios, so they know if you miss or hit. And of course, now things are much more electronic than they were then. But my point here is there's nowhere to hide. And then after every engagement, you do various engagements during the day and then again at night, and you're scored, and the standards you have to meet are all there. But you have observers that debrief you at the end. And so my crew and I had prepared well. We've done well in all the preparatory training, and we were excited to get out there and do this. And as we go for our qualification run, the run that counted against all our training statistics and everything, we just were not having a good day. And it's pretty hard to miss a target in the M1 tank, but it is possible, and we proved that. If there was a barn door on the range, it was probably not going to be hit with us that day. And I say that a bit jokingly, but we weren't having a good day. Our timing, for whatever reason, was off. It was slow, and we missed several targets that we just never should have missed. And so we were in danger of not qualifying. And of course, as a leader, leading by example, which is part of the military culture, my inner voice is starting to crank in that this is a failure that I don't need early in my career. And in fact, during our night run, we did not continue to do any better, and we did not qualify. And I can remember very vividly as we were moving back off the range in our tank, there was no real talk amongst the crew. There was certainly no happy talk between us. Everybody was in a sort of a down mood. And we knew we were going to go into a very tough debriefing. And so we made it to the debriefing, and the observers, evaluators showed us and played us everything that we had done. Some things right, but not everything, obviously. And in that debriefing was our crew and the observers, but also my boss, Mark, my company commander, and my next level boss, Craig, my battalion commander. And it was normal for them to be in crew debriefings and listen, but they knew we'd had a tough run and we hadn't qualified. And this would be a blemish on the overall training statistics. And they were there, and they were quiet during the debriefing, and it was professional, tough to hear, but we did it. And then it ended and the observers left, and Mark and Craig stayed with us. And this is fairly late at night now, and we're tired. We're not too happy. And they spent a few words with us, but their words were of encouragement and to get focused for the next day. And because we would have to go re-engage the certain scenarios that we didn't do well on. And we talked for a few minutes, and then the crew left, and it was Mark, Craig, and I alone for a few minutes, and we spent a few minutes talking, and then we left. And I remember this was the part that is important to me, is as we exited the tent, Mark left, and it was just Craig, my battalion commander, the more senior leader, with me. And he just stopped for a second, and it was a beautiful Kentucky night, as I remember, and the moon was pretty full. And we stopped outside the tent, and he said, Bob, I just want you to know that I know you're a good officer, and that this gunnery, your qualification run here, I know it's probably eating at you quite a bit. And I want you to know, I know you're a good officer, and I just want you to forget about it. I want you to know that this is okay. You'll get over this. I want you to learn from it, but let's not dwell on it. And I just remember those words so much from that evening. And I think, as I think about my leadership, the rest of my career, how I spent and approached failure when folks that worked for me or the teams that I've been on failed something, how I acted in that moment. And what I took away from Craig and Mark in that moment was, leaders got to be there for other leaders. He saw the bigger picture around us, that this was an isolated event. And the part I would I would also highlight is, sometimes I hear this and we've all heard this adage of, you can do 100 things right and one thing wrong, and everybody remembers that, something like that. Well, I will say that Craig and Mark never brought it up again. It was never reflected on any performance evaluation. They never talked to me about it again. I went on, never had any incident like that happen where I failed before. But, it still, I had that inner voice. My career was going to be impacted, but Craig in that moment sort of was there to help me get through failure and recover it. It took some time. It didn't happen in that instant. But I think that's something that is just one of those leadership moments that has stayed with me throughout my entire career.
What an amazing story. What an amazing story. I think those are those defining moments, right, of the relationship between a leader and the emerging leader that they're developing, and how that moment is handled kind of sets the tone for growth, right? And how we can take feedback and how we can continue to grow those opportunities. I mean, just reflecting on your story, and I want to invite others on the call to reflect as well, any stories that they have or thoughts about how leaders guide through failure. But I really like the fact that you started off with a point that the data, the reflection first was, here's what the targets were, or here's what the performance was, and here's what we observed. So it was no muddling of that. It was just fact-based, no judgment, just here's what happened.
That's right.
And they were there for that. They didn't try to debate it or anything. They just presented the facts. And then the fact that these two leaders went further with you into kind of an outside environment and walked you through how to take that failure in and how to build on that in terms of your future performance. They just didn't walk out of the room. They stepped forward with you, right? That was an interesting part of your story. Was it scary when you walked out of there? Did you have any idea what they were going to say to you?
The emotions I had at that moment were high. I mean, they were, full of emotions, right? Thinking about career, failure, all these different things. And they really calmed them down. I mean, you have to think about this for a minute. This qualification was going to be a black mark on the overall statistics or training performance of all the organization. They were responsible for that. They knew that, but they weren't worried about that. That's not what they were focused on. They focused, I mean, of course they were, concerned, right? They have to, it's part of their responsibility, but they really focused on us, the crew, and specifically, in that moment, me. And it's just a moment I won't ever forget. And I like to think that as I have had failures with folks that worked for me, I was there for them as well.
Right. I think often we have to remember, at least I don't know anyone that's perfect, right? And I think how we learn and grow through that feedback. James Zotsky is on with us. James, good to see your name coming in on our Inspire series. But he makes a point in the chat that it's so important to reflect not only after failures, but also after successes. But he said that you probably learn more from that failure than you do from success. It's more memorable. It sticks with you. What do you think about his comment?
I like him. There's that term thanks, James, for that. There's that term that you often hear it now, celebrate failure. I get it. I get what they're saying there. I mean, I wasn't going to go jump up and down about this failure, but I understand the learning value of failure, right? And so I do think you learn from that. Now, James, in the military, and one of the things that I do teach often when I talk about the use of after-action reviews or debriefing and how leaders do that in the military, is that we can learn from success and failure. And we often sometimes can over gravitate towards failure, but we learn quite a bit from success as well. And sometimes one of the things I did learn in the military is we have to point that out too, because you grow from that, understanding what you're doing well, because you can always do better, even if you do well. But I like your comment. Thank you, James.
Yeah, good point. And Eva joining in here saying that, it's important to recognize that in your response to the feedback, you're willing to admit your part in the failure and your desire to improve. So that duality of the relationship between the leader and the emerging leader that's growing. So she's saying your acknowledgement yourself, Bob, saying, okay, yeah, I own the result and I want to improve. And so she was talking about the point in her comment here in the chat that today she sees a lot of defensiveness with leaders and resistance to be open to the fact that we're growing constantly and being open to critique. What are your thoughts about that?
I do think that there are some. I see I read a lot of the language and the literature about vulnerability, and I think, and this goes into some of my work at the executive level. Sometimes is that leaders need to be able to take their shields down a little bit, right? To be open and vulnerable. It's okay to say, I don't have the answer to that, but let's figure it out. I think sometimes that the leaders, as they rise, they think they have to have all the answers. In fact, the higher you go, you won't have all the answers. And so you have to be comfortable not being the expert. But, feedback, Jenny, is come up a couple times. And if you think we have time, I'd love to share this story because it gets to feedback.
Give me one more.
Okay.
Give me one more.
All right. So this happened not at Fort Knox. We're done with Fort Knox stories. This happened much later in my career in one of my early tours in the Pentagon. And this one I would title "You're the Expert." And this one occurred with my boss, Lisa, who was a fantastic leader who went on to lead at very, very high levels in the department throughout her career. But it was late in the afternoon one day when I got a call from Lisa, and she said, it was about 3 or 4 in the afternoon. She says, "Hey, Bob, I just got a call that we need to go see a very senior leader tomorrow morning very early about a topic that you're the action officer on, that I was working on, sort of the subject matter expert." And this is a 4-star level engagement in the Pentagon. So this was important. And she said, "Look, it's late. We're going to see him early. Put together just a few of the background information as a read ahead. We'll provide it. And I just want you to know that as we go in there tomorrow, you're the expert. He'll let us know what it is. I'm there with you." She was knowledgeable about it as well, but I was working all the details. And so the next morning, we went in to see this senior leader, and it was very early. It was before his normal day got going. And we walked in his office and we sat down, and he says, "I appreciate the read ahead. I've looked at it. I don't have any questions there." And I remember he closed the book and he said, I need to understand this. I need to understand that, and different things. And it was a very much a conversation. And Lisa added in, and a lot of it was me, because I was, sort of immersed in this topic. And so we had this conversation for 20 or 30 minutes. But that conversation at that moment with him is not what's really important. What's important is what happened after that. As we left that morning, it was still very early in the morning, and Lisa and I exited, and we were in a hallway in the Pentagon, which are often quite busy, but this time was still very early. It wasn't that busy, and we walked, and we were heading back towards our offices. She said, "Hey, Bob, let's just stop for a minute." And she said, "I just want to tell you that was a really good discussion with this senior level. Here's what I saw. He didn't need the details. He needed to connect the dots at his level. He needed contact, or the context of what was going on, the bigger picture, so that he could engage other leaders at his level. And you did that really well. You connected dots. You gave them the friction points, the stakeholders that were involved, and you were not immersed in the details, and you weren't scripted." And so, that was a conversation that we had for a moment. But in the spirit of feedback, even though I was fairly senior and had been immersed in a feedback culture all my life, what strikes with me as I reflect on this from a leadership perspective is, here's a senior leader and another fairly senior leader having a discussion about what we just did and sharing feedback. She made me feel that I was valuable to that conversation. She affirmed that I helped this senior leader, and she wasn't, she was just giving me a bit of recognition and appreciation for that. But she also said, what's important is that you'll have more of these engagements throughout your career. And I want to let you know what one that you can remember that really felt good, and that was a good model for that. And so in terms of feedback, I think the immediate, in the moment, informal feedback that takes 2, 3, 4 minutes to share something positive, which I think sometimes is overlooked these days. We are wired quite often to find fault when it comes to feedback, but to find the valuable things there that help people grow, that make it memorable. So that's what I remember about that one. Now, of course, there is trust involved with Lisa in that story, where she said, "Bob, you're the expert. I'm here to support." She didn't feel compelled as the leader to have to carry the message. I mean, there's a whole lot in that story, but on the spirit of feedback, I thought I'd share that one.
Great. And I think a good reminder for all of us, again, to take that time to give that in the moment feedback and to reassure and, let someone know like the great work that they're doing. And I also want to underscore your point on trust, that she didn't feel that she had to jump in and do the meeting herself, that she recognized and elevated you as that expert leader. So good points coming in. Any other comments from our audience, please provide them in the chat. We'll make sure that Bob gets those. But thank you so much for sharing your stories on leadership and the lessons learned. Very valuable for us today, and for all of us to remember to take the moment in failure to reflect and encourage, and to be, encouraging with others, to take the moment to learn from those failures, to give immediate feedback as leaders, and don't just wait for that professional development conversation once or twice a year. So thanks so much for all of the encouraging words today. And thanks for everyone joining. We have more programs coming up at our Bridge Innovate Inspire series. Another digital studio test drive coming up later this month on March the 24th. If you want to use digital platform to do design thinking and innovation, you should be here. We're going to be looking at prototyping. I'll be talking about our entrepreneurial growth series in April that we're going to be launching in June. It's open to anyone who wants to join in. If you have a business that you want to grow, an organization you want to grow, we'd love to have you join that program. And Hannah Lancaster will be talking about the value proposition and a tool that you can use to understand customer needs. And then we're so excited that Vincent Phillips is also going to be joining us in Lead Out Loud. What a dynamic speaker. He'll be with us in May. So thank you, Bob. Again, welcome to Chattanooga. We are so fortunate you're here, and I hope that you'll share with us more stories again and sometime soon.